Hello, I'm Andri, and I do welcome you once again to my essential philosophy readings. Why these philosophical sessions? Or rather, why these sessions in philosophy? Well, they are designed primarily for an introductory course in philosophy based on texts of classical, both Western and Oriental philosophers, and contemporary writers who are writing in that very tradition, to enable and also to encourage many of us and many of you, students, listener, everyone interested in philosophy, to see alternative philosophical approaches to specific topics and most essential philosophical issues. I have included many readings from the Buddhist Pali Canon on the nature of the self, many readings on epistemology that draws back to Buddhist and Hindu thought, feminist readings on the mind and body problem, ethics and social justice issues, etc. There will be, and some at least I'm hoping for, 50 readings based on their cogency of thought, clarity of expression, diversity, historical significance, and primarily on accessibility. These sessions in philosophy will be organized to 7 basic topics: the nature of philosophy, philosophy of religion, theories of knowledge, philosophy of mind and body, problems of self, free will and determinism, ethics, and political and social philosophy. Also, these sessions in philosophy will be as an assistance in reading primary texts, and they will incorporate many interesting and essential features that will enable students and every one of you to read the works with greater understanding and benefit. Our today's lecture will be on Courage and Life by Friedrich Nietzsche. We all know that Friedrich Nietzsche is the most impressive and effective representative of what could be called a philosophy of life. Life in this term is the process in which the power of being actualizes itself. But in that actualizing itself, it overcomes that in life which, although belonging to life, annihilates life. One could call it the will, which contradicts the will to power. In his work, Also sprach Zarathustra, in the chapter called The Preachers of Death, Nietzsche points to the different ways in which life is tempted to accept its own negation or annihilation. They meet an invalid or an old man or a corpse, and immediately they say, life is refuted. But they only are refuted in their eye, which seeth only one aspect of existence. Of course, Nietzsche wanted to say that life has many aspects. It is ambiguous. Nietzsche has described its ambiguity most typically in the last fragment of the collection of fragments which is called Der Wille zur Macht, the will to power. Courage is the power of life to affirm itself in spite of this ambiguity, while the negation or annihilation of life because of its negativity is an expression of cowardice, said Nietzsche. On this very basis, Nietzsche develops a prophecy and philosophy of courage in opposition to the mediocrity and decadence of life in the period whose coming he saw. Like the earlier philosophers, Nietzsche, in Zarathustra, considered the warrior, whom he distinguishes from the mere soldier, an outstanding example of courage. What is good? Ye ask. To be brave is good, not to be interested in long life, not to want to be spared, and all this just because of the love for life. The death of the warrior and of the mature man shall not be a reproach to the earth. Self-affirmation is the affirmation of life and of the death which belongs to life itself. Virtue for Nietzsche, as well as for Spinoza, is exactly the self-affirmation. In the chapter on the virtuous, Nietzsche writes, "It is your dearest self, your virtue. The ring's thirst is in you. To reach itself again struggles every ring and turns itself." This analogy describes better than any definition the meaning of self-affirmation in the philosophy of life. The self has itself. The self possesses itself, but at the same time, it tries to reach itself. Here, ad exemplum, Spinoza's conatus becomes dynamic, as generally speaking, one could say that Nietzsche is some kind of a revival of Spinoza in dynamic terms. Life in Nietzsche replaces substance in Spinoza, and that is very important. And this is true not only of Nietzsche, but of most of the philosophers of life. The truth of virtue is that the self is in it and not an outward thing. That your very self be in your action, as the mother is in the child. Let that be your formula of virtue, said Nietzsche. Insofar, of course, as courage is the affirmation of oneself, it is virtue altogether. The self, whose self-affirmation is virtue, and courage is the self which surpasses itself. And this secret spake life herself unto me. Behold, said she, I am that which must ever surpass itself. By italicizing the last words, Nietzsche indicates that he wants really to give a definition of the essential nature of life. There doth life sacrifices itself for power, he continues, and shows in these very words that for him self-affirmation includes self-negation, not for the sake of negation, but for the sake of the greatest possible affirmation, for what he calls power. Life creates and life loves what it has created, but soon it must turn against it. So willeth my life's will. Therefore, it is wrong to speak of will to existence or even of will to life. No, one has to speak of will to power, to more life. Life, willing to surpass itself, is the good life. And the good life is the courageous life, Nietzsche said. It is the life of the powerful, solid soul and the triumphant body whose self-enjoyment is the virtue itself. Such a soul banishes everything cowardly, it says, bad. That is cowardly. But in order to reach such an ability, it is necessary to obey and to command, and to obey while commanding, said Nietzsche. This obedience, which is included in commanding, is the opposite of submissiveness. The latter is the cowardice which does not dare to risk itself. The life is the risk. The submissive self is the opposite of the self-affirming self, even if it is submissive to a god, Nietzsche said. And yet, it wants to escape the pain of hurting and being hurt. The obedient self, on the contrary, is the self which commands itself and risketh itself thereby. In commanding itself, it becomes its own judge and its own victim. It commands itself according to the law of life, the law of self-transcendence. The will which commands itself is the creative will. It makes the whole out of fragments and riddles of life. It does not look back. It stands beyond a bad conscience. It rejects the spirit of revenge, which is the innermost nature of self-accusation and of the consciousness of guilt. It transcends reconciliation, for it is the will to power. In doing all this, the courageous self is united, Nietzsche said, with the life itself and its secret. We may conclude by reading Nietzsche. In our discussion of Nietzsche's ontology of courage with the following quotation: "Have ye courage, O my brethren, not the courage before witnesses, but entreat an eagle courage, which not even a God any longer beholdeth. He hath heart who knoweth fear, but vanquisheth it, who seeth the abyss, but with pride. He who seeth the abyss, but with eagle's eye, he who with eagle's talons graspeth the abyss, he hath courage." These words do actually reveal the other side of Nietzsche, that in him which makes him an existentialist, the courage to look into the abyss of non-being in the complete loneliness of him who accepts the message that God is dead. About this side, we shall have more to say in my following philosophical sessions. Till that time, I am saying goodbye.